Do you enjoy creepy horror stories? Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more spooky videos from Scare Street.
Laconia School by Ron Ripley. "You used to work here?" Andrea asked. Peter Horton, frustrated that he had no cell service, looked up from his phone. "Huh? Oh, yeah. For about a year. Then they closed the place." The girl nodded as her boyfriend pulled onto the side of the road. Pete had been contacted by the couple, Andrea Coulson and Matthew DeVry, to see if he could give them a tour of the compound. Pete had readily agreed. The school, he knew, was inaccessible. No one from the state of New Hampshire wanted people prowling around it. Most of the buildings were condemned, and few people wanted to remember that the Laconia School had even existed. The Laconia School wasn't a school in the sense that kids and teenagers went there to gain knowledge. It was a place for the mentally handicapped, those kids who couldn't function in society and needed extra help away from the world. $1,000 to go, they had told him in person at a small coffee shop in Manchester, New Hampshire. $1,000 to show us the main buildings and tell us what used to happen there while we film it. "This is a good spot," Matthew told them and took the keys out of the ignition. Pete glanced around, frowning. "Main gate's still about a half-mile up." "Yeah," Andrea smiled. "We don't want to go in that way, though. We were up here scouting last week, and we saw there was an old access road that runs parallel to the fence. Matthew and I figured we could walk to the closest building and start there." Nobody said anything about walking. Pete grimaced. "What the hell? It's easy money. They'll look for a break in the fence. There won't be one because the state actually keeps people out of here, and that'll be the end of the trip. I've got the cash in my wallet, so no matter what, I've been paid." "Ready?" Matthew asked. Pete gave him a fake smile and nodded. "Sure am." Pete observed them talking to one another excitedly as the three of them climbed out of the car and stepped into the warm summer air. They were an odd couple as far as he was concerned. Both were dressed in all black, with matching boots and T-shirts that read, "Anger Investigations," arched over a silhouette of a graveyard. Andrea's hair was dyed a vibrant pale blue, and Matthew's blonde hair was shaved into a topknot. The two laughed as they pulled on large knapsacks and adjusted the shoulder straps. "Reminds me of some of the patients here," Pete thought, as he glanced to either side of the road, searching for a sign that there might be some sort of traffic, some reason for them to call off the expedition before it even began. There was nothing. Matthew passed him by, went to the trunk of the car, and opened it. A moment later, the younger man extracted a large pair of bolt cutters. Pete looked at it with genuine surprise. "What the hell are you going to do with those?" "Cut the fence," Matthew replied pragmatically. "What?" Pete asked, dumbfounded. Andrea smiled. "The way we see it, Pete, this property belongs to the state of New Hampshire. We, as tax-paying citizens, are the state of New Hampshire. So, we're going to cut the fencing that was put up illegally and take a peek at our property." "That doesn't make any sense," Pete responded. "I mean, come on. This place is patrolled by state police." "Not this late in the day," Matthew informed him, closing the trunk. "Besides," Andrea added, removing her phone from her pocket, "I have an app on my phone that lets me access the police scanner. We figured out what code they use when they're about to patrol this stretch. They went by earlier today, so we know they won't be back around until tomorrow or midnight at the earliest." Pete forced a smile. "Oh, guess you two have it all figured out." "As much as we can," Matthew nodded. Pete found himself sweating uncomfortably as the younger man cut through the fence, and sooner than he would have liked, Pete was leading the way onto the property. He shivered with discomfort, looking out over the buildings as Matthew and Andrea came in behind him. "Wow," Andrea murmured. "It's so, I don't know, desolate and lonely out here." "You weren't here when the kids were," Pete muttered. It sure as hell didn't sound desolate or lonely. No? Matthew asked, leading the way down a small hill to the access road. Nah, Pete told him. I mean, come nighttime, they all screamed and cried. Not just the kids, mind you, but the adults, too. There were adults here? Andrea asked, surprised. Oh, yeah, Pete said. They didn't just let them back out into the world. Not at first. I mean, when they shut the place down, yeah. Before that, well, what are they called now? Mentally challenged? Well, they were kept here. I worked with a couple of aides who said there were people still from the 40s and 50s in the place. They were sterilized because that's what the government did to slow people back then. But they were still here. Man, I remember one woman, I think she was 60 or so, she would scream every night from 8 to 9, just like clockwork. I don't know how she knew when it was 9, but as soon as it hit that magic hour, she was quiet, went right to sleep. They reached the access road, and the sound of their shoes on the old cracked asphalt was loud in Pete's ears. It was then that he noticed an unnatural stillness about the compound. He couldn't hear any insects or birds. As the three of them drew closer to the first dormitory building, Pete frowned. There used to be birds all along the roof, he remembered. Hundreds of finches and small blackbirds. Where the hell do they all go? He glanced at Matthew and Andrea, cleared his throat, and asked, You guys notice anything strange? They looked to him, and Matthew shook his head. Andrea nodded, though. Yeah, she told him. It's quiet here. Nice and peaceful. I wouldn't go that far, Pete mumbled. Do you hear any bugs or birds? No, Matthew began. Then he stopped walking. Pete and Andrea did the same. Looking to his girlfriend, the young man whispered, Holy crap, babe. No animals or insects. Andrea nodded excitedly. Yes, yes. What? Pete demanded, looking from one to the other. What's so exciting about it? It's weird. It ain't natural. No, it's supernatural, Matthew laughed. Andrea, seeing Pete's growing frustration and lack of understanding, smiled. This is good for us, Pete, she explained. When there are no insects, birds, or animals, it means there are ghosts around. Matthew nodded. Oh, yeah. We wanted to get some stock footage of the place and go through it to look for places where ghosts were. But this is beyond anything we hoped for. Wait a minute. Pete held up his hands. What the hell do you mean by ghosts? We're paranormal investigators, Andrea explained. You're actually looking for ghosts? He asked, scowling. I thought I was just showing you the place, not going on a ghost hunt. You are just showing us the buildings. Andrea's voice was pleasant. We're not asking you to go in and demand ghosts come out or anything. We just want to get some footage. That's it. Pete swallowed dryly. That's it? That's it, man, Matthew grinned. Come on, Andrea and I know that ghost hunting isn't for everybody. No, all we need, like we told you in the cafe, is for you to point out the buildings, what went on there, and maybe in some of the bigger ones, tell us a little more. Maybe if a door's open, Andrea smiled, you could just step inside for us. We'd love to get a sense of proportion, you know, like have someone standing there and say, oh, this happened here. And then when we look at the footage, we can see if anything was going on in the background. The idea of anything unseen going on in the background sent a chill through Pete's body. He cleared his throat and hesitated as Matthew and Andrea started to walk toward the main building. Pete looked around him, realized it would be worse to stand there alone, and hurried after them. In a moment, he was a few steps behind them, breathing hard and hating the fact that he was almost 60 pounds overweight. Andrea smiled over her shoulder at him. We're almost there, Pete. He nodded and struggled to regulate his breath. Looking ahead, he saw the main building, and memories crept into his thoughts. His nostrils flared at the remembered stench of the floors, the men and women failing to get to the bathroom in time. That one Christmas, when someone gave them bad ham. Hell, that was miserable. Had to listen to them throwing up the whole night. They sure weren't happy when we made them clean the mess in the morning. He recalled beds pressed together, some of the younger children huddling together to keep themselves warm, and the older men and boys who would prowl the floors looking for their next victims. Pete had hated when he had to work second or third shift. Of course, I couldn't get away with slapping them around as much when I was on first shift, he thought. It was the only way they'd listen, though. You'd think the directors would have realized that, what with them being doctors and all that good stuff. Nope. All that education, and they couldn't get the residents to stop screaming at night. They passed by the first of the dormitories, and Pete's stomach tightened. The glass in the window frames had been broken, but most of the wire fencing bolted over the windows was still intact. He remembered bringing kids into the rooms, shutting the doors and locking them. The residents were at their worst when they got back from seeing their families for a few days. They never should have been allowed to see their families, he thought, rehashing an old argument with himself. It only made them more difficult to control. "Does this bring back memories?" Andrea asked. Oh, yeah." Pete shook his head and sighed. "It could be a rough place, you know? Real rough." "How so?" Matthew asked. "Was it the screaming?" "No, I mean, yeah, that was annoying," Pete continued. "Really, though, it was the residents. You couldn't teach half of them anything. They'd just sit there in a chair and stare at a wall. And they were like animals, you know? Just fighting and chasing after each other. You'd get them all crammed into the shower and have to watch them to make sure no one was getting fresh with another one. Or you'd get someone who was brand new and they wouldn't shower with everyone, so we'd have to get the hose out. A couple of times with a fire hose, though. Well, that taught them right quick." "I bet," Andrea murmured. Pete shivered, disliking the way the empty windows appeared to watch him. It was unnerving, and the closer they drew to the main building, the farther he wanted to get from it. He had an uncomfortable feeling of déjà vu as they walked toward the main entrance. When they reached it, he almost sighed with relief at the sight of a thick steel chain and padlock looped through the handles of the doors. "Do you want to take some shots out here?" Pete asked, feeling his nervous sweat dry on the back of his neck. "No," Andrea smiled. "Come on, there's got to be a back door, right?" "There is," Matthew answered. "I forgot to tell you that I managed to pull the blueprints off the web last night." The younger man looked at Pete. "There were pool tables on the lower level, right?" "Yeah." Pete smiled tightly. "Yeah." Matthew nodded. "There were doors onto a patio, too. I mean, the stuff wasn't there originally, but the plans I found showed the modifications to the original structure. I know we have a good half hour, maybe 45 minutes before the sun sets, and it's supposed to be a full moon tonight. That way we can work right up until sunset and have plenty of light to get back to the car." Great, Pete thought, and he followed the couple around the side of the building. He looked down at his feet, refusing to acknowledge the windows he passed by. He could remember the sensation of walking past them when he worked there. Whenever you looked in the windows, some of the residents were looking out. I hated that, he thought, repressing a shiver. Used to smack the wiring just to get them to back off. Bunch of damned animals is what they were. "How long did you work here?" Andrea asked, her question cutting into his memories. "Huh? Oh, about 10 years or so." He lied. Pete had worked closer to 15, but he didn't want them to know. There was something strange about the pair, and the need to keep some aspects of his time at the Laconia school secret seemed to be important. Who the hell goes ghost hunting in an old home for the mentally handicapped? Sounds like the dumbest thing ever. "That long?" Matthew shook his head. "I'm impressed. Most people didn't work here that long, did they?" "No," Pete admitted. "There was a lot of turnover. The staff had it tough. Bad pay, crappy hours, no training. It wasn't a fun job either. Residents always freaking out. Sometimes you had to restrain them or get the duty nurse to dope them up so you could get control of them. Yeah, it was rough. Did you ever have to restrain them? Andrea asked. Sure, Pete answered. Part of the job. Did you ever get hurt? There was concern in her voice. Yeah, I got hurt, Pete answered. Look at this. They stopped, and he turned his left arm so that the inner part of his forearm was readily visible. There was a chunk of skin the size of a $50 missing from his arm. It had healed over badly, despite the skin grafts. What happened? Matthew asked in an awed tone. This little runt, Pete grumbled. He got upset with me for something stupid, and when I tried to move him, well, he bit down and took a piece out of me. Swallowed the damned thing, too. Doctors tried to skin graft and all that stuff, but it didn't take. Said it was because of it being a bite from a person. Anyway, that's the worst one. I had a few others, but nothing like this. Wow, Andrea murmured. Can I get a picture of it? Pete chuckled. Sure. Yeah, that's fine. She took her camera out and got a close-up shot of the old injury. Andrea shook her head. That's just crazy. Yeah, Pete agreed. Didn't feel too great either. I bet, Matthew said. Well, let's see if we can get in the back, okay? Pete didn't respond. Instead, he trailed along behind them, his nervousness increasing with every step. By the time they reached the back doors, his heart was slamming against his chest, and he had to shove his hands into his pockets to keep them from trembling. Andrea and Matthew spoke in low voices, the volume steadily increasing with their excitement. There was no lock on the back door. It stood open, gaping, waiting to drag Pete back into the building. I should tell them no, he thought, panic flaring up. They can't make me. It's illegal, breaking and entering even. Then he thought about the $1,000 they had paid him. They can't take it away from me. But they could. He had the money in his wallet, and they were both younger than he was. They could leave me here, too. How would I like that? How long would it take for someone to come and get me? I don't know anybody that would. I mean, nobody I know's got a car that could make the trip up here. Ready, Pete? Andrea asked. He jerked at the sound of his name, gave her a weak smile, and nodded. Yeah, let's get it done. Andrea led the way into the building, and Pete followed her. Matthew brought up the rear, taking out a small video recorder from his knapsack. There was a loud click, and then a bright spotlight filled the air as they stepped into the rec room. The pool tables were still there, Pete saw. Most of the green felt was ripped and stained. A few broken cues were on the floor. Scattered among them were chipped balls. The air stank of mildew and filth, both of which reminded Pete of when he had worked there. Along the concrete walls were paintings of cartoon characters from Looney Tunes and Hanna-Barbera. In the strange, powerful light of Matthew's recorder, the paintings took on a lurid appearance. Pete's throat tightened, and his blood pounded in his ears. You look a little sick, Pete, Andrea observed. You okay? He nodded, wiped the sweat from his brow, and managed to mutter, I'm fine. What was this room used for? She asked, pointing to a small closet-like space with an open door. There was no window in the room, and Pete knew why. It was kind of like a penalty box for hockey, he answered, keeping the explanation vague. So, what? They would go in there for 2 minutes and then come back out? Matthew asked. Yep. Andrea walked up to it, peered in, and then gave an exaggerated shiver. Wow, that's scary. I would hate to be locked up in there. Did any of the kids have problems with it? Matthew asked from behind him. Huh? Pete asked, turning around to face him, blinking and trying not to look directly at the light. Oh, yeah, a few did. You know, I mean, who wants to be locked up, right? Do you think we could get you to stand a little closer? Andrea asked. This would be a great shot. In fact, we could probably just do a few shots here, and then that would be it. We could head back. Closer? Pete asked. Yeah, she said. Pete glanced at her and then at the penalty box. If you're afraid, that's fine, Matthew began. No, Pete bristled. I ain't afraid. So, just a couple of shots of this and me, what, talking about the place? That's it, Matthew agreed. Sure, Pete sighed. Yeah, let's get this done with. He walked to the open doorway, ground his teeth together, and turned his back to it. Okay, Andrea smiled. All I'm going to do is ask you a couple of questions. You answer them, then we stop and walk back out. Sound good? Yeah, Pete nodded. So, Pete, Andrea said, you worked here for 14 years and 3 months, right? Yep. And you were an aide primarily for boys and men in this building, the main structure of the Laconia school? She asked. Uh-huh. You were the one who came up with the idea of the penalty box? She inquired. Yeah. He stopped, suddenly hearing the questions he had readily been answering. Wait. How'd you know how long I worked here for? Because I researched you, she answered. The pleasant tone was gone from her voice. I interviewed a few people. Staff, patients, residents, you know, everyone. They all agreed that you were the worst, Pete. The absolute worst. You were the one who beat a young man to death, Ian Richards. Pete stiffened. Don't know nothing about this. Let's go. I want to go. He took a step forward, and Andrea slammed into him, knocking Pete off balance. The young woman, who was stronger than she looked, drove him backward into the penalty box. Pete tripped and fell on the floor. As he struggled to get up, the door slammed closed. A chain rattled, and a lock snapped into place. Pete sat there in stunned silence. Andrea's voice came through the door. Ian Richards was my mother's brother, the young woman stated. And you killed him. He's not the only one, though, is he, Pete? Anger burned in Pete as he struggled to his feet. I didn't do anything. And you can't ask me any questions like this, he snapped. I'm innocent. I did my damned job. You didn't do anything close to your job, she replied. I'm not confessing. I'm not here for a confession, Andrea told him. Pete blinked. What? You think I want to record your confession? She let out a bitter laugh that caused him to take an involuntary step back. No, I don't want that. I want you to suffer, Pete, the same way you made the residents suffer. You're going to stay in here and play your favorite game. No, Pete whispered. This ain't right. What did you call it? The Rumblies? Her voice was barely audible. Come on, Pete begged. Don't. How many of them begged? She was closer, her voice now penetrating the door. How many? Please, Pete whispered. How many? Andrea demanded, slamming into the door. All of them, Pete screamed. Every single one of them, okay? Silence greeted his exclamation. Open the door, please, Pete moaned. It's dark in here. It's scary as hell. Come on. I'm sure it is, Andrea replied. Her voice was lower, as if she had taken a seat near the door. They talked about it, being scared, alone, hungry. They said you would walk by and hit the door, just to add a little more fear. Sometimes their friends would slide food under the door, saltine crackers. It helped with their hunger, but not their thirst. No way to get water in, not without you seeing it. Must be terrible being thirsty and not being able to do anything about it. Pete swallowed dryly, realizing he hadn't had anything to eat or drink since lunch, and that had been hours ago. His stomach rumbled at the thought. "We're going now, Pete," Andrea informed him. "We're leaving you here."
"No!" Pete shuddered, shaking his head. "You can't leave me here. The cops will know. They'll get me out, and then they'll arrest you for false imprisonment."
"No." Matthew's voice was cold. "The state trooper who does this run, he's my brother. You used to torture our cousin, Tommy Daggett. They released Tommy when they shut this place down. He remembers the way you would drag him into the bathroom, stick his head in the toilet and flush it. You would tell him to drink up because it would be a while before he had anything else. Then you would drag him down here, right down the stairs to the penalty box, and in he'd go. He takes medicine to sleep at night. Too many nightmares. He came to live with us when he got out of here. We listened to his screams at night, and when we learned what was wrong, my brother and I made a promise to do something about it." "There are a lot of us out there," Andrea added. "I want you to know that, Pete. You hurt a lot of people, not just the ones you were supposed to be helping, but their families, too." Pete shook his head.
"No."
He took his phone out of his pocket, turned it on, and saw again that he had no cell service. Terrified, he stared at the phone. As if she knew what he was trying to do, Andrea said in a low voice, "No service up here, Pete. None at all. It helps that someone built us a disruptor for the cell phones. It's in this room, attached to a battery that will last longer than you." Pete stiffened.
"What do you mean?"
"How many hours did Tommy suffer in the penalty box?" Matthew asked, bitterness thick in his words. "For 3 years you did it to him. And not just him, of course. No, you would send him into the box whenever you wanted. Sometimes you put him in for hours."
"Listen, I made mistakes, okay?"
Pete's voice raised several octaves as fear gripped him.
"Just mistakes."
"Well, you're going to have to pay for those mistakes," Andrea told him. "You're staying in the box for as long as Tommy did."
"So what are you saying? A couple of hours?" Pete asked. "That's it, right?"
"No," Andrea answered. "We did the math. We figured on 3 hours a day, every day, for 3 years. 4.5 months, Pete. You'll be in here for 4.5 months.
"No," Pete whispered. "No, you can't do that to me."
"You don't get a choice," Matthew answered. Pete's mind raced.
"What are you going to feed me, huh?"
"What did you feed them when they were in the box, Pete?" Andrea asked.
"Please." Pete could barely get the word out. "Come on. Please."
"What did you feed them?" She struck the door.
"Nothing,"
Pete screamed. "That's right." Andrea's voice was cold. "Nothing. That was the whole part of the rumblies, wasn't it, Pete? To try and hear the rumbling of their stomachs because they were hungry."
"Please," Pete begged. "Please let me out."
There was no response. A moment later, he heard the outer door close. The heavy rattle of a chain reached his ears, and Pete began shaking.
"Please,"
he whispered, closing his eyes against the darkness.
"Please."
The only response came from his stomach, which let out a long, low rumble.
Are you looking for more creepy horror stories? Click the link in the description or search Scare Street on Audible for a list of all our bone-chilling titles. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more spooky videos from Scare Street. See you in the shadows.